Amelia Goodman lived in a small town in the north of Wyoming and has always prided herself on being a native. During her long and difficult life, the old woman had a chance to see both good and bad. Her husband David passed away 7 years ago, leaving the inconsolable widow in a dilapidated house in constant need of repair and a bunch of baseball cards, which he's been collecting since childhood. David and Amelia lived together for about 40 years and rightfully enjoyed the respect and love of the locals. All this time, Mrs. Goodman worked as a language teacher at a local school. She had taught, without exaggeration, no less than a third of the town's population. And if it weren't for the insidious disease that took her husband's life, Mrs. Goodman could have said that she had a happy family. Amelia and her husband had a daughter, Catherine, who got married long ago and moved away with her businessman husband to the other end of the country. At first, Catherine insisted that Mrs. Goodman move in with her, but her husband's business went uphill, and she gave up on this idea, distracted by the success and the newly acquired wealth. Sure, Amelia and Catherine stayed in touch and even talked on the phone on big holidays. These conversations, however, were purely formal, lacking genuine interest and warmth. Knowing that her daughter had her own family now, Mrs. Goodman made it a point not to ask for much of her attention and time. After the death of her husband, the old woman got used to relying on herself for everything she needed and kept the house alone with her cat, Churchill. Since her dilapidated house had constantly required care and attention, Mrs. Goodman did her best to keep it in good condition. Mrs. Goodman turned to some of her friends only in rare cases when she couldn't do without the male strength. But otherwise, she tried to deal with everything on her own. Most of the time, it was Gordon White who came to visit Mrs. Goodman. Gordon was passionate about hunting. The man disapproved of poaching, and thus he always had the necessary license to shoot game that was permitted by law. Helping Mrs. Goodman with the house renovations, the man flat out refused to take the money she offered him. At the time, Gordon said over and over again that it was his way of saying thanks for the wonderful school years he had with Mrs. Goodman as his teacher. Therefore, when Mrs. Goodman decided to repair her fence, the old woman didn't hesitate to turn to Gordon, who she treated like her own son, because she could still remember him as the little first grader she taught. Much to Mrs. Goodman's surprise, this time the man came over with more than just his construction tools. With the mysterious smile, Gordon took off his backpack, and a second or two later, someone's fluffy little head popped out of it. Wow, and who do we have hiding here? What a wonderful little thing. Gordon, did you bring me a puppy? Mrs. Goodman asked admiringly. Gordon hesitated and blushed deeply in response. The fact was that Gordon remembered the old woman's request and how he promised to find her a good puppy. And the other day, as he was walking by the edge of the forest, the man found a little wolf cub in the bushes. He was making loud squeaky noises from hunger and cold. Gordon didn't know where the cub's mother and brothers had gone, but judging by the footprints of a bear he saw nearby, Gordon assumed that they could have become victims of a larger predator. The young hunter's heart couldn't allow him to leave the little cub to a certain death in the forest, and so he decided to save the wolf. However, Gordon already had 2 dogs at his home, and he realized that his watchdogs were unlikely to get used to the small forest predator. The man was thinking about what he could do in this situation, when suddenly he remembered Mrs. Goodman, who had long asked him to find her a puppy. You know what? I'll bring her this little thing. The old woman will be happy while he's growing up, and then he'll hear the call of the wild sooner or later and will run off into the forest. And I'll find her an actual puppy in the meantime, reasoned Gordon. Mrs. Goodman didn't even realize that it was a real wolf in front of her, since she had never seen the forest predators in person. Needless to say, I am very pleased, so very pleased, said the old woman, picking up the wolf cub. Blinded by the bright sun, the cub sneezed twice, and then licked his lips and looked into Mrs. Goodman's eyes. Oh, you're probably hungry. Now, I'll be quick. The old woman fussed around the little cub, bringing him into the house. The fluffy cat named Churchill, who was sitting on the windowsill, saw the forest orphan and immediately began to hiss loudly, his hair standing on end. Hush, dear, can't you see that he's hungry and scared? the old woman reasoned with the cat, and taking his bowl, poured a little canned meat into it. Outraged by such impotence, the offended Churchill turned away and watched Gordon on the fence through the window, showing his disapproval as best he could. Meanwhile, the cub quickly and with great appetite finished off his portion of the canned food and stared inquiringly at Mrs. Goodman. "Well, aren't you a little glutton?" The old woman laughed and quickly fulfilled the cub's silent request. When the cub was finally full and his sides got noticeably rounded, he looked like he was about to fall asleep. Mrs. Goodman smiled knowingly and laid a soft bedding for the animal in a cardboard box. The wolf cub meticulously sniffed the bed and, having satisfied his interest, fell asleep. With a smile on her face, Mrs. Goodman closed the curtains in the room so that the bright sun wouldn't interfere with the cub's sleep, and then went outside, intending to help Gordon repair the fence. Casting an inquisitive glance at the old woman, Gordon realized that she took the wolf cub for a puppy. "Okay, I'll let him stay here for a little while and get stronger, and then I'll see what to do about it," thought Gordon, getting more and more convinced that it was a good idea to bring the cub to Mrs. Goodman. That day, the man worked almost until nightfall, and when the fence was looking like new, he examined his work with satisfaction. "Thank you, Gordon. I don't know what I'd do without you. You have golden hands, and you are a good man," Mrs. Goodman said admiringly, looking at the former student with maternal care and love. As the old man was about to leave, Mrs. Goodman handed him a bag of sweets she had prepared for his two children, and then went back into the house, where the little cub had already woken up and made a real mess. Mrs. Goodman named him Teddy in honor of the teddy bear from the cartoon, and partially to match the impressive appetite of the little forest orphan, who was growing by leaps and bounds. Time went by, and the old woman began to notice that, having grown up significantly, Teddy looked nothing like a regular yard dog. Mrs. Goodman has repeatedly witnessed how the neighbors' dogs are afraid of Teddy and tried to avoid him. Any final doubts were dispelled by one of the local hunters, who saw the wolf sitting on the lawn of the old woman's house and instinctively reached for his gun. "Hey, what's the matter, mister? What's your issue with my dog Teddy?" Mrs. Goodman asked indignantly. By a thankful coincidence, she was watering the flowers in the garden at the time. "What kind of dog do you think this is? It's a real wolf. Take my word for it. I've seen many of these predators in my lifetime," the hunter replied calmly. At first, Mrs. Goodman was shocked by the news, but then she pulled herself together and thought about all the sweet moments she shared with Teddy during his time at her home, which calmed her down. The old woman knew that the young wolf never showed any aggression towards her or anyone near her. Well, okay, so Teddy's a wolf. He may be a forest predator by blood, but a kind and loving heart is beating in his chest. He can live with me as long as he needs, the old woman reasoned. A year passed, and during this time, the tame wolf guarded Mrs. Goodman's yard better than any dog ever could. The only two things that made Teddy different from his domesticated brother were that he didn't know how to bark and wag his tail. One cold fall evening, there was a knock on Mrs. Goodman's door. Wondering who it could be, the old woman fearlessly opened the door and saw three men. One of the strangers was holding a gun, which he immediately pointed at Mrs. Goodman. "Be quiet, old woman. Don't make a sound, or I'll shorten your life in an instant. Do you have any money, any valuables?" he hissed, bursting into the house. Teddy, who had been sleeping peacefully next to the sofa, rushed at the offenders with a furious growl. Taken by surprise, the criminals got confused for a moment, which was just enough for the wolf to bite them several times on the ankles. Frightened screams instantly filled Mrs. Goodman's house. While Teddy was fiercely fighting the offenders, the old woman sneaked into the bedroom and dialed 911. But her call was interrupted by the sound of a gunshot that rang through the house. One of the men managed to use the weapon and wounded Teddy in the hind leg. The old woman rushed to the wolf with tears in her eyes, forgetting about her own safety altogether. Frightened by the noise caused by the shot, the criminals decided to flee, but unfortunately for them, the police had already surrounded Mrs. Goodman's house. The criminals surrendered without much resistance. As it turned out, they had already committed several robberies also including an unsuccessful attack on a collector van. Unable to stop crying, Mrs. Goodman tried to bandage Teddy's leg, but the wolf kept tearing off the bandages to lick his wound, the way Mother Nature told him. A week later, Teddy recovered and regained his ability to walk. The news of the wolf's brave deed got quickly picked up by all the country's TV channels, turning the tame predator into a real hero on the news. But Teddy didn't care about fame. He loved Mrs. Goodman more than his own life and was always ready to sacrifice himself to save his owner.